The Ship Orion, Part 1. We shall be pardoned for passing rapidly over the painful details. We shall merely reproduce an item published in the Journal de Paris some few months after the remarkable events that occurred at Montreuil-sur-Mer. An old convict named Jean Valjean has recently been brought before the Var Assize under circumstances calculated to return attention. This villain has succeeded in eluding the vigilance of the police. He had changed his name and had even been adroit enough to procure the appointment of mayor in one of our small towns in the north. He had established in this town a very considerable business, but was at length unmasked and arrested, thanks to the indefatigable zeal of the public authorities. He kept as his mistress a prostitute, who died of the shock at the moment of his arrest. This wretch, who is endowed with Herculean strength, managed to escape, but 3 or 4 days afterward the police retook him, in Paris, just as he was getting into one of those small vehicles that ply between the capital and the village of Montfermeil, Saint-Étienne. It is said that he availed himself of the interval of these 3 or 4 days of freedom to withdraw a considerable sum deposited by him with one of our principal bankers. The amount is estimated at 600,000 or 700,000 francs. According to the minutes of the case, he has concealed it in some place known to himself alone, and it has been impossible to seize it. However that may be, the said Jean Valjean has been brought before the Assize of the Department of the Var in indictment for an assault and robbery on the high road commenced Ville et Army some 8 years ago, on the person of one of those honest lads, who, as the patriarch of Ferney has written in immortal verse, de se voir arrivant tous les ans, et dont la main légèrement essuie, ses longs canaux engorgés par le suie. This bandit attempted no defence. It was proved by the able and eloquent representative of the Crown that the robbery was shared in by others, and that Jean Valjean formed by one of a band of robbers in the south. Consequently, Jean Valjean, being found guilty, was condemned to death. The criminal refused to appeal to the higher courts. The king, in his inexhaustible clemency, deigned to commute his sentence to that of hard labour in prison for life. Jean Valjean was immediately forwarded to the galleys at Toulon. Jean Valjean changed his number at the galleys. He became 9430. Part 2. Very shortly after the time when the authorities took it into their heads that the liberated convict Jean Valjean had, during his escape of a few days' duration, been prowling about Montfermeil, it was remarked in that village that a certain old labourer, named Boulatruelle, had a fancy for the woods. People in the neighbourhood claimed to know that Boulatruelle had been in the galleys. He was under police surveillance, and, as he could find no work anywhere, the government employed him at half wages as a mender on the crossroad from Gagny to Lagny. What had been observed was this. For some time past, Boulatruelle had left off his work at stone-breaking and keeping the road in order very early, and had gone into the woods with his pick. He would be met toward the evening in remotest glades and the wildest thickets, having the appearance of a person looking for something and sometimes digging holes. The worst puzzle of all were the schoolmaster and the tavern-keeper, Thénardier, who was everybody's friend, and who had not disdained to strike up an intimacy even with Boulatruelle. "He has been in the galleys," said Thénardier. "Good Lord! No one knows who is there, or who may be there." So they made up a party and plied the old roadsman with drink. Boulatruelle drank enormously, but said little. He combined with admirable art and in masterly proportions the thirst of a guzzler with the discretion of a judge. However, by dint of returning to the charge, and by putting together and twisting the obscure expressions that he did let fall, Thénardier and the schoolmaster made out, as they thought, the following. One morning, about daybreak, as he was going to his work, Boulatruelle had been surprised at seeing under a bush and in a corner of the woods a pickaxe and spade, as one would say, hidden there. However, He supposed they were the pick and spade of old Sixfours, the water carrier, and thought no more about it. But on the evening of the same day, he had seen, without being seen himself, for he was hidden behind a large tree, a person who did not belong at all to that region, and whom he, Boulatruelle, knew very well, or, as Thénardier translated it, an old comrade at the galleys, turn off from the high road toward the thickest part of the woods. Boulatruelle obstinately refused to tell the stranger's name. This person carried a package, something square like a large box or a small trunk. 2 or 3 hours later, Boulatruelle saw this person come forth again from the woods, this time carrying now not the little trunk, but a pick and spade. The pick and spade were a ray of light to Boulatruelle. He hastened to the bushes in the morning, and found nothing, neither more nor the other. He thence concluded that this person, on entering the woods, had dug a hole with his pick, had buried the chest, and had then filled up the hole with his spade. Now, as the chest was too small to contain a corpse, it must contain money, hence his continued searches. Boulatruelle had explored, sounded, and ransacked the whole forest, and had rummaged every spot where the earth seemed to have been freshly disturbed, but all in vain. He had turned up nothing. Nobody thought any more about it at Montfermeil. Part 3. Toward the end of October, in that same year, 1823, the inhabitants of Toulon saw coming back to their port, in consequence of heavy weather, and in order to repair some damages, the ship Orion, which was, at a later period, employed at Brest as a vessel of instruction, and which then formed a part of the Mediterranean squadron. The presence of a vessel of war in port has about it a certain influence which attracts and engages the multitude. It is because it is something grand, and the multitude like what is imposing. Every day, then, from morning till night, the quays, the wharves, and the piers of the port of Toulon were covered with a throng of saunterers and idlers, whose occupation consisted in gazing at the Orion. She was moored near the arsenal. She was in commission, and they were repairing her. The hull had not been injured on the starboard side, but had a few planks been taken off here and there, according to custom, to admit the air to the framework. One morning, the throng which was gazing at her witnessed an accident. The crew was engaged in furling sail. The topman, whose duty it was to take in the starboard upper corner of the main topsail, lost his balance. He was seen tottering. The dense throng assembled on the wharf of the arsenal uttered a cry. The man's head overbalanced his body, and he whirled over the yard, his arms outstretched toward the deep. As he went over, he grasped the man-ropes, first with one hand and then with the other, and hung suspended in that manner. The sea lay far below him at a giddy depth. The shock of his fall had given to the man-ropes a violent swinging motion, and the poor fellow hung dangling to and fro at the end of this line, like a stone in a sling. To go to his aid was to run a frightful risk. None of the crew, who were all fishermen of the coast recently taken into service, dared attempt it. In the meantime, the poor topman was becoming exhausted. His agony could not be seen in his countenance, but his increasing weakness could be detected in the movements of all his limbs. His arms twisted about in horrible contortions. Every attempt he made to reascend only increased the oscillations of the man-ropes. He did not cry out for fear of losing his strength. All were now looking toward the moment when he should let go of the rope. At an instant, all turned their heads away that they might not see him fall. There are moments when a rope's end, a pole, the branch of a tree, is life itself, and it is a frightful thing to see a living being lose his hold upon it, and fall like a ripe fruit. Suddenly, a man was discovered clambering up the rigging with the agility of a wildcat. This man was clad in red. It was a convict. He wore a green cap. It was a convict for life. As he reached the round top, a gust of wind blew off his cap and revealed a head entirely white. It was not a young man. In fact, one of the convicts employed on board in some prison task had, at the first alarm, run to the officer of the watch, and, amid the fusion and hesitation of the crew, while all the sailors trembled and shrank back, had asked permission to save the top man's life at the risk of his own. A sign of assent being given, with one blow of a hammer he broke the chain riveted to the iron ring at his ankle, then took a rope in his hand and flung himself into the shrouds. Nobody at the moment noticed with what ease the chain was broken. It was only some time afterward that anybody remembered it. In a twinkling he was upon the yard. He paused a few seconds and seemed to measure it with his glance. Those seconds, during which the wind swayed the sailor to and fro at the end of the rope, seemed ages to the lookers on. At length the convict raised his eyes to heaven and took a step forward. The crowd drew a long breath. He was seen to run along the yard. On reaching its extreme tip, he fastened one end of the rope he had with him, and let the other hang at full length. Thereupon he began to let down by his hands along this rope. And then there was an expression sensation of terror. Instead of one man, two were seen dangling at that giddy height. You would have said it was a spider seizing a fly, only in this case the spider was bringing life and not death. 10,000 eyes were fixed upon the group. Not a cry, not a word was uttered. The same emotion contracted every brow. Every man held his breath, as if afraid to add the least whisper to the wind which was spraying these two unfortunate men. However, the convict had, at length, managed to make his way down to the seaman. It was time. 1 minute more, and the man, exhausted and despairing, would have fallen into the deep. The convict firmly secured him to the rope, which he clung with one hand, while he worked with the other. Finally, he was seen reascending to the yard, and, handing the sailor after him, he supported him there for an instant to let him recover his strength, and then, lifting him in his arms, carried him, as he walked along the yard, to the cross trees, and from there to the round top, where he left him in the hands of his messmates. Then the throng applauded. Old galley sergeants wept. Women hugged each other on the wharves, and on all sides voices were heard exclaiming, with a sort of tenderly subdued enthusiasm, "This man must be pardoned!" He, however, had made it a point of duty to descend again immediately and go back to his work. In order to arrive more quickly, he had slid down the rigging, and started to run along the lower yard. All eyes were following him. There was a certain moment when everyone felt alarmed. Whether it was that he felt fatigued, or because his head swam, people thought they saw him hesitate and stagger. Suddenly the throng uttered a thrilling outcry. The convict had fallen into the sea. The fall was perilous. The frigate Algeciras was moored close to the Orion, and the poor convict had plunged between the two ships. It was feared that he would be drawn under one or the other. 4 men sprang at once into a boat. The people cheered them on, and anxiety again took possession of all minds. The man had not again risen to the surface. He had disappeared in the sea, without making even a ripple, as though he had fallen into a cask of oil. They sounded and dragged the place. It was in vain. The search was continued until night, but not even the body was found. The next morning, the Toulon Journal published the following lines: November 17th, 1823. Yesterday, a convict at work on board the Orion, on his return from rescuing a sailor, fell into the sea and was drowned. His body was not recovered. It is presumed that it has been caught under the piles at the pierhead of the arsenal. This man was registered by the number 9430, and his name was Jean Valjean.